Going to the polls in the tiny Gulf monarchy of Bahrain. The island kingdom holds its first parliamentary elections since protests inspired by the Arab Spring. But with opposition parties calling for a boycott, what can the vote hope to achieve? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. It has been nearly 4 years now since protesters took to the streets in Bahrain demanding more rights and an end to the discrimination by the Sunni royal family against the majority Shia community. And as the tiny island nation prepares for the first parliamentary elections since then, opposition activists say little has changed, so much so that the main opposition parties are boycotting the vote. A vote that's being closely watched by Gulf neighbours and also the United States, which considers Bahrain an ally in the region. Al Jazeera's Charles Stratford covered the crackdown on protesters by security forces in 2011 and has this report for Inside Story.
These are some of the more than 260 candidates competing for 40 seats in Bahrain's election. Saturday's parliamentary poll is the first since a crackdown on a Shia Muslim-led protest movement in 2011. Around 70% of this Sunni Muslim-ruled monarchy is Shia, and the largest Shia party is boycotting the vote.
What a failure it is for the government to beg for a vote from a people who are marginalised by them. The government is looking for the impossible from any rational person.
The 2011 protest made Bahrain's neighbours nervous. The Saudi military played an important role in clearing the protesters, who had set up tents in the centre of the capital, Manama. The Bahraini authorities then arrested thousands of people. Real power comes from Bahrain's unelected political leadership. As international condemnation increased, the king appointed what the government described as an independent inquiry into abuses committed by security forces. The findings were a damning indictment, including details on the torture of detainees and the unfair sacking of Shia employees in the public and private sector. While some progress has been made on police reform, rights organisations say abuses continue. Many prominent political figures and human rights activists remain in jail. There are almost nightly protests across the country. Police raids and arrests are common. The government and its supporters say they are trying to reach out to the opposition.
The door is open to them. There was an invitation for dialogue, a second invitation to pursue dialogue, but they refused to participate. They refused because in their mind Bahrain should be delivered to Iran.
The government accuses Iran of trying to stir revolution in Bahrain. The opposition says it just wants a greater role in politics. Rights groups say the US isn't doing enough to protect human rights in Bahrain. The US Fifth Fleet is based there. It's been almost 4 years since the crackdown on what has been described as Bahrain's Arab Spring moment. It is unlikely these elections will help with any meaningful reconciliation in this deeply divided country. Charles Stratford for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guests in our London studios. We have Ali Al Aswad, a member of the Al Wafaq National Islamic Society and a former opposition MP. Joining us from Bahrain's capital, Manama, is Mansour Arayat, chairman of the Gulf Council for Foreign Relations and a former member of Bahrain's Shura Council or Upper House. And completing our panel in Beirut is Joseph Kashishian, columnist for the Gulf News and a specialist on Middle East affairs. Hello and welcome. Ali Al Aswad, why is your party boycotting these elections?
Well, after 3 years of negotiations, failed negotiations in Bahrain with the government, where there was no touching to the substance. So the decision from the political parties, political national parties, 5 main political societies in Bahrain, they decided not to run for this election because we believe this election will not solve the crisis and will not help the Bahraini for the better future.
Isn't it better, though, to be part of the political process than out of it? I mean, are you effectively saying to your supporters that there's going to be another 4 years in the wilderness?
Well, we was in a political process in the parliaments. We haven't seen any seriousness from the regime in Bahrain to solve those important things in Bahrain: discrimination, social justice, jobs for the Bahrainis, housing issues, and the constitutions. The constitutions, it is not agreeable by the whole Bahrainis. I'm talking about the 2002 constitutions, which it comes after national charter. We agreed on national charter in 2001 to be part of the systems, to have constitutional monarchies. And we have seen ourselves like out of the game. The parliament is not the decision of the legislative as the democratic countries. We have upper house and we have the parliaments. Those 40 Shura council members, they can vote, they have a veto, they can say no, even though if the elected members of the parliaments, they said yes. So at the end of the day, it's a decision of the authority, not the decision of the people in Bahrain.
Mansour Ariad, do you understand, therefore, why the opposition might be boycotting the election? What are your thoughts on that?
I think you have a better picture if we look at it from a bigger picture perspective. I think what we're trying to do in Bahrain, or even in the whole GCC, is to evolve some sort of democratization, but basic democratization means GCC values, like there is an Egypt democracy, there is a Malaysian democracy. There is an evolution from a GCC perspective, but the speed is the challenge. You see, we want speed within stability. Now the fear is if you go too fast, you might create some sort of instability in Bahrain. This is something you don't want to do, especially in a small country where debt to GDP is around 40%. We are very much connected to the other GCC countries, and we cannot evolve in isolation within this context of GCC.
So let me just ask you something quickly. When you talk about speed, are you saying that too much speed will lead to instability in the country?
Too much speed will lead to instability, and also slow speed will lead also to instability. So it's trying to strike that balance within a context of GCC. That is a difficult one.
But aren't they just asking for basic human rights?
No, it's the bigger picture. It's not the human rights or the parliament. It is something more concrete. The thing is, how do you interpret the current constitution in a proactive way, in a way that you can implement proactively? This is a challenge for Bahrain, a challenge for Saudi Arabia. It depends what constitution. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, the constitution is the book itself. So you do have elements of Islam, you do have some elements of human rights that it is not within the values of GCC means, because these are monarchs at the end of the day. Now, how do you evolve monarchies within a GCC values in a proactive way that sustains stability?
Possibly given equal rights to all. Ali Al-Aswad, you want to get in there to say something. What is it?
Yeah, that's very simple. You can give the people rights in Bahrain. You can give them, we were talking about the power sharing. We are not talking about something not implemented in democracy. We had few examples, one example in Northern Ireland, another example in South Africa, and we have seen what's happening in these countries. And we are talking to the governments in Bahrain how to give the people some power, to share the power with them, to share the decisions. Within the context of the region, of the ruling families in the Gulf, we could stay 50 years or 100 years again, and we will talk about democracy. We cannot implement it because there is heritage and cultures in this region. We are in 2014. We are after Arab Spring now. We are talking about youths, new generations. They are demanding for democracy. They need their voice to be heard by the high authorities in the countries, in Bahrain or any other country. If we talk about Bahrain, it's not something new. It is similar to what happened in 1950s, 1960s, 1990s, and early 2000s. It's exactly the same. The people demand exactly the same. I think it's time to the governments in Bahrain to listen to the Bahrainis, to have stability in the country.
Okay, let me bring in Joseph Kachichin. What do you think is going on here? And do you think it was wise for the opposition parties to boycott these polls?
Well, it's natural that they would boycott because, as you just heard, there is a disconnect between what a segment of the population would like to have and what the government is ready to give. I think there are two sets of problems, really, for Bahrain and for the rest of the GCC countries that need to be sorted out before you have meaningful reforms at the political level. On the one hand, you have to decide whether or not you're going to have absolute monarchies or constitutional monarchies. The two are entirely different from each other. Even within the system of the monarchic regimes of the region, if you were to have a constitutional monarchy, then obviously you would have a great deal more to say for the national population, citizens' rights, you can protect human rights, elections are held regularly, so on and so forth. And there is a system of accountability that is fairly sophisticated in a constitutional monarchy. On the other hand, you really have another set of problems which have to do with power sharing. Whether or not the Gulf Cooperation Council leaders are willing to share some of the power with their populations. Of course, this is easier said than done, but when you bring the two items together, as seems to be happening right now in Bahrain, then you're going to have some kind of a clash, you're going to have boycotts, because even if you were to have political participation, one is not sure whether at the end of the process you're going to have real power sharing. Because as you've just heard a few moments ago, the recent experience has meant that people were going through the motion, participating in elections, electing officials, but at the end of the day, there was no power sharing whatsoever. Therefore, the current stalemate in which both sides are opposed to each other with no solution. But over the long term, I think those are the two primary issues that need to be worked out among the different members of the intelligentsia and the governments of the region.
Monza, what do you make of those comments? And also tell us about why the opposition party has been banned. I mean, does that prohibit them from taking part in any way?
Well, it doesn't. They chose not to participate. So that's a decision. That's fine. But the thing is, how do you evolve the political process after the elections? This is the whole objective of trying to find a way out. Now, I do see the point that was raised by the person in Beirut. The GCC itself needs to evolve its interpretation of what democracy is. It will always be power sharing, true. But in practice, vetoes of this power sharing will always be sustained under monarchs. That is something that the opposition is not willing to accept.
Okay, let's throw that to the opposition. Ali, I mean, is that the problem? Is it a problem with the monarchy, or is it more a problem with power sharing and basic human rights?
It's a bit complicated. I mean, if we talk about the universal human rights, if you talk about there's no black and white in the human rights. If the Bahraini government, they don't respect the human rights, this is finished. They are in the blacklisted of the human rights area. If we talk about the political solutions in Bahrain, now 3 years and a half, we've been talking to the governments. They never talk to us in the parliaments. They always talking to the opposition outside the parliaments. This is really a fundamental issue in Bahrain. I mean, when we address the demands, when we talk to the governments, when we talk to the authority about the Bahraini demands, they say we understand these things. When we try to touch the substance, when we try to touch the judiciary systems in Bahrain or security for all, they always will bring kind of excuses and kind of justifications why we don't have a Shia community, for example, in the defense force, and always will talk about the Shura Council. It is kind of assurance to the ruling family in Bahrain. This means there is no confidence if there is no confidence between the ruling family and the Bahraini people, it means they need a lot of work to be done earlier than the dialogue. We were talking about the dialogue. Unfortunately, this dialogue has never been successful. We have seen the governments in Bahrain issue the decree of we're talking about the redistricting the whole Bahrain, omitting one full governorate in the central of Bahrain and taking some voices from the Bahraini community, from the opposition Bahraini community, putting them here and there just to reduce the number of seats of the opposition parties in the parliament.
Okay, let me just ask Mansour, excuse me jumping in here. I mean, how you can have real dialogue when parts of the peaceful opposition are sitting in jail?
This is not the question. The question is currently, how do you want to move Bahrain or move the GCC? The terms of reference at this point in time in the evolution of the GCC democratization is that monarchs have the veto in dialogue. This is the context at this point in time, or this point in history. Opposition needs to recognize that important value. This is a GCC value at this point in time. This is the basis. Beyond that, discussion, other points of reference can be taken into consideration.
Mansour, but what about those who've been negatively affected by your policies? There's a lot more to that than what they see as just GCC concerns regarding your elections.
What has happened is that the opposition have evolved the grassroots towards a revolution. I mean by defining revolution, i.e. that the monarchs abolish their veto rights at this stage of the political process. This is pushing it too far. Now, what you have seen at the grassroots is basically a reflection of this mismatch of left and right.
Is that what it is, Joseph, a mismatch of left and right, or are we seeing what's been often described as a fake sectarian war to justify implementing any reforms in the country?
As I was listening to both of the guests, obviously the same thought crossed my mind that we have now really touched the taboo subject, which is sectarianism in Bahrain in particular. I think that it's very clear now that what really is preventing a dialogue of occurring is what the majority population of Bahrain, who happen to be Shia, want from the minority-led government who happen to be Sunni. And there are individuals in the government of Bahrain who are trying to overcome this sectarian division. And as our friend from Bahrain has just stated, this is an absolute monarchy, and no monarch in his right mind is going to surrender any kind of power or authority to opposition forces. Conversely, the opposition forces are going to demand tooth and nail that, in fact, their rights are respected. So therefore, there is an added dimension of sectarianism here, which is extremely dangerous, which is the problem that has led us to the clashes that we have had so far, and regrettably, with no solution in end, unless one of two things happen. On the one hand, you could have a fall of the government, which the GCC regimes will not allow, or you will have a further crackdown of the opposition, which will create more bloodshed and more difficulties. I think at this point, we are in a dilemma that has absolutely no solution. In the short term, there is no solution to the current dilemma, especially that the GCC countries have put their foot down and said, we're not going to allow the Bahraini government from falling. I mean, I think it's very clear that the GCC force, by sending their troops inside the country, have essentially sent that message. So therefore, something else must be worked out. Some kind of a original dialogue must be created between the opposition and government forces. And I think the way to do this, if I may just simply throw in something that I have not really heard a lot of people discuss, is you need to really remove the conversation from the current leaderships on both the opposition as well as the government. It is time for some neutral forces to come in. Individuals who are essentially the wise man of Bahrain, no matter their background, no matter their sectarian affiliation, you need to really bring forth a group of 4 or 5 individuals, the wise men of Bahrain, who can sit down and figure out what kind of a new social contract will eventually be introduced in Bahrain. That's a long-term process. It will not happen overnight, but in the short term, I don't think there is a solution to the current stalemate.
Okay, well, interesting thoughts put forward by you, Joseph, then. And let's just discuss why everyone in the region is watching what's happening as far as Bahrain is concerned, why it's so important. It lies between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And because of its location and religious demographics, some observers contend that it's also caught between its Sunni and Shia neighbours. Sunnis make up around 30% of Bahrain's Muslim population, with the Shia community accounting for about 70%. The Gulf Kingdom has been ruled by the Khalifa family since 1783. It's gained its independence from Britain in 1971 and has since become a vital Western ally. It is home to the US Navy's 5th Fleet and is one of several Arab states supporting US-led airstrikes against fighters with the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. Ali Aswad, do you think the regional importance allows possibly the country to get away with what I know the opposition say is abuse of locals in the region because of this perceived Shia threat?
I think, first of all, we need to highlight on this. There is no agenda with the opposition, like a sectarian agenda. We don't hold anything with regards to the Shia. And we are not talking on behalf of the Shia in Bahrain. We're talking about the Bahrainis' demand as a Bahraini, as a Shia and Sunnis in Bahrain. We do understand what's happening in the region. That's why we've sent also messages through internal, I would say, proxies, or external or internationals, also officials, high diplomat, for the better of Bahrain to have stabilities now. What's happening in the region in Iraq and Syria, it's not in favor of the regimes in either in the Gulf countries or specifically in Bahrain. We had some Bahrainis, they are fighting in Iraq. We had some Bahrainis, they are also in Bahrain now, going here and there, talking about ISLs and supporting also the Islamic States, as you just mentioned now. In this case, we are, as an opposition, we feel we are responsible to move forward, to have a political solutions in Bahrain, to discuss the people's demands, to talk about what the Bahrainis need. There is no point if you bring another other than the representative of the people to speak with. Even if the Bahraini governments, they run election tomorrow, even if they bring a new MPs, those MPs also, they were in the parliaments in 2011 when we resigned from these parliaments, and this crisis never solved, the solution never happened in Bahrain. No matter if you bring Ali Al-Aswad as a person, or if you bring Mr. Mansour as a person, and they talk to each other, if you don't listen to the people, if you don't reach out the community, if you don't go in the villages and you see what's happening day and night, repressions from the governments, from the policemen there, here and there, they are not respecting the human rights, the basic human rights, it's not being respected. Things will be too complicated. What's happening in the region, it's encouraging us. That's why we were very open. We was talking about transitional period to solve this problem in Bahrain. There was nobody listening to the opposition from the governments to understand we are in 21st century. We are not 100 years before, like what we were demanding when we were in 2000 or in year of 1950s or 1920s.
Okay, let's leave it there. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Ali Al-Aswad in London, Mansour Ayad in Manama, and Joseph Kachichian in Beirut. And thank you very much for watching. We're always interested to hear what you think. You can post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or contact us on our Twitter handle, which is @AJ Inside Story, mine @Jane Dutton. Thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.